So when you hear the word Viking, what's the first thing that pops into your head? Probably horned helmets, right? Long ships, brutal raids, this image of just pure savage fury. And look, that picture isn't entirely wrong, but it's missing the most important, and frankly, the most interesting part of the story.
This wasn't just some dramatic line from a movie. This was a real prayer that churches actually added to their services after the year 793 AD. Why? Because that was the year Viking longships appeared on the horizon of the holy island of Lindisfarne in England. They sacked the monastery, they killed or enslaved the monks, and they took off with all its priceless treasures. That one single event, right there, pretty much cemented their terrifying reputation across all of Europe for centuries to come.
So you gotta ask, what was behind all this? Was it just random, bloodthirsty violence? A crime of opportunity? For a long, long time, that's exactly what history told us. But the truth? Well, the truth is way more complex. The raid on Lindisfarne wasn't the beginning of a story. It was more like the explosive middle of a war that had already started. Yeah, to really get what drove the Vikings, we've got to hit rewind, because in their minds, they were just responding to a war that had already been declared on them, on their culture, their people, and their gods. To understand the Viking attack in 793, you have to know what the Frankish Emperor Charlemagne was doing for decades beforehand. He was on a mission, a violent campaign to expand his Christian empire. And he saw the pagan Norse people to the north as a direct threat, something to be either conquered or completely wiped out. This wasn't a Cold War. This was a very, very hot one. So in 772, Charlemagne ordered the destruction of what was arguably the most sacred site in the entire Norse religion, their world tree Yggdrasil. Now for the Vikings, this wasn't just burning some big tree, this was an act of cosmic warfare. It was like tearing down the holiest cathedral, mosque, and temple all at once, a direct attempt to trigger their version of the apocalypse, Ragnarok. So when word gets to the Vikings that England is just allied with their mortal enemy, Charlemagne, they can see the writing on the wall. The attack on Lindisfarne wasn't just for plunder. No, it was a message. It was a brutal, strategic, preemptive strike against a brand new ally of the empire that was trying to literally erase them from existence.
But here's the thing. If we only focus on the violence, we're missing like half the story. The Vikings weren't just warriors. These people were some of the most daring explorers, sophisticated traders, and influential nation builders of their time.
While some of their relatives were raiding Europe, other Norsemen were just pushing the boundaries of the known world. I mean, they settled the totally uninhabited island of Iceland. A guy named Eric the Red, an exile no less, established a colony in Greenland. And then his son, Leif Erikson, lands in North America, what he called Vinland, almost 500 years before Columbus even set sail. Think about that.
And their influence wasn't just in the West. Oh no. In the East, Swedish Vikings, who the locals called the Russ, traveled down the great rivers of what's now Russia and Ukraine. They weren't just raiding, they were trading and settling, creating this massive network that stretched all the way from the Baltic Sea to the Byzantine Empire. In fact, the name Russia literally comes from the Rus.
And get this, according to their own stories, their sagas, the local Slavic tribes were so torn apart by internal conflict that they basically sent an invitation to the Rus saying, hey, come rule over us and bring some order. It just shows you their dual reputation. Yeah, they were feared warriors, but they were also seen as capable administrators who could actually build a nation.
And in what has to be one of history's greatest ironies, the descendants of the men who terrorized Christendom became its most elite defenders. The Byzantine emperor in Constantinople trusted these Norsemen so much that he made them his personal bodyguards, the legendary Varangian Guard. They went from raiding the empire to being the last line of defense for its emperor. Just incredible.
Now, as Vikings settled across Europe, a slow but really profound change started. They began converting to Christianity. But this wasn't always some hostile takeover. Actually, some very clever Christian missionaries found common ground. They basically mapped their new faith onto the old beliefs. They'd say, you like Odin, the All-Father? Well, we've got God the Father. A peace-loving Jesus was kind of a tough sell, but Christ the warrior from the book of Revelation, well, he was a perfect stand-in for their mighty god Thor.
And this cultural mixing led to some absolutely wild moments. After being defeated by England's King Alfred the Great, the Viking king Guthrum didn't just agree to get baptized as part of the peace deal. No, he asked King Alfred himself to be his godfather. Can you even imagine that? The conqueror becomes the spiritual father to the conquered? It just shows you a world of constantly shifting alliances and ideas.
But, like all great eras, the Viking Age couldn't last forever. And its final act is a blockbuster, centering on one man who really embodied every single aspect of the Viking spirit: the warrior, the exile, the commander, and the king. His name was Harald Hardrada, which basically means hard ruler, and this guy lived up to it. After being exiled from Norway, Harald went and made his name and a massive fortune as a legendary commander in the Varangian Guard. He was the absolute quintessential Viking adventurer who comes home rich and famous to take back his kingdom.
And he wasn't just tough, he was brilliant. There's this one story that perfectly captures his cunning. He's stuck in a long siege, can't break the city walls. So what does he do? He has his men announce that he's died and ask for permission to bury him inside the city's church. The defenders agree, but as the funeral procession enters the gates, Hardrada bursts out of his own coffin, sword in hand, and his men take the completely shocked city. It's pure Viking genius. All right, so the whole Viking Age comes to a head in one single, fateful year, 1066. The King of England dies without an heir, and suddenly it's a three-way, winner-take-all battle for the throne. You've got the Englishman, Harold Godwinson, you have William, the Duke of Normandy, who, by the way, is a descendant of Vikings himself, and of course, you've got our guy, the last Viking, Harald Hardrada.
Hardrada invades England from the north with his massive fleet of 300 ships. He wins in early battle, but then he gets careless. Harold Godwinson's English army force marches north and catches him completely by surprise at a place called Stamford Bridge. In the brutal fight that follows, the great Viking king, the last Viking, is struck by an arrow in the throat, and he's killed.
The defeat was absolutely catastrophic. I mean, just look at this number. Of the 300 ships that Hardrada sailed to England, they only needed 25 to carry the survivors home. The great Viking invasion of England was over.
But hold on, here's the final twist. While Godwinson is up north celebrating his victory, the third claimant, William of Normandy, lands his army in the south. The exhausted English army has to march all the way back down, and they're defeated at the famous Battle of Hastings. So, while the last Viking was dead, the new King of England was himself a direct descendant of Viking settlers. The age of raids was over, but the Viking legacy would now rule from the throne.
And that legacy continues to this day, but in a way that would be totally unrecognizable to someone like Harald Hardrada. You might call it a second, much more subtle Viking invasion.
What happened next is one of the most incredible transformations in world history. The homeland of those feared Viking warriors, Scandinavia, is now globally known for the exact opposite: peace, diplomacy, social welfare. I mean, think about the Nobel Peace Prize. It's awarded in Oslo, the heart of the old Viking kingdom of Norway. The irony is just staggering.
Today, the modern Scandinavian model is admired and copied all over the world. We're talking about some of the highest standards of living, a tiny gap between the rich and poor, a deep commitment to social justice and global cooperation. It's an invasion, all right, but an invasion of ideas, not long ships and battle axes.
Which leaves us with a final thought to chew on. The first Viking invasion changed the map of Europe with force. This second one is changing the world through influence. So you have to wonder, which invasion will history remember as being more powerful? The one that conquered with the sword, or the one that's conquering with its ideals?